Memories, Dreams, Reflections by Carl Jung, recorded and edited by Anelia Jaffe and translated by Richard and Clara Winston. Introduction. He looked at his own soul with a telescope. What seemed all irregular he saw and shewed to be beautiful constellations, and he added to the conscious, hidden worlds within worlds. Coleridge, Notebooks. This book had its inception during the Eranos Conference held in Ascona in the summer of 1956. There, the publisher Kurt Wolff, in conversation with friends from Zurich, spoke of his wish to have Pantheon Books of New York publish a biography of Carl Gustav Jung. Dr. Yolande Jacobi, one of Jung's associates, proposed that the office of biography be entrusted to me. All of us were well aware that the task would by no means be an easy one. Jung's distaste for exposing his personal life to the public eye was well known. Indeed, he gave consent only after a long period of doubt and hesitation. But once he had done so, he allotted to me an entire afternoon once a week for our work together. Considering the press of his regular program of work and how easily he tired, for even then he was past 80, this was a great deal of time. We began in the spring of 1957. It had been proposed that the book be written not as a biography, but in the form of an autobiography, with Jung himself as the narrator. This plan determined the form of the book, and my first task consisted solely in asking questions and taking down Jung's replies. Although he was rather reticent at the beginning, he soon warmed to the work. He began telling about himself, his development, his dreams, his thoughts with growing interest. By the end of the year, Jung's affirmative attitude towards our joint efforts led to a decisive step. After a period of inner turbulence, long submerged images came out of his childhood and rose to the surface of his mind. He sensed a connection with ideas in the works he had written in his old age and could not grasp it clearly. One morning he informed me that he wanted to set down his recollections of his childhood directly. By this time he had already told me a good many of his earliest memories, but there were still great gaps in the story. The decision was as gratifying as it was unexpected, for I knew how great a strain writing was for Jung. At his advanced age he would not undertake anything of the sort unless he felt it was a task imposed on him from within. Here was evidence that the autobiography was justified in terms of Jung's own inner life. Sometime after this development, I noted down a remark of his, quote, "A book of mine is always a matter of fate. There is something unpredictable about the process of writing, and I cannot prescribe for myself any predetermined course. Thus this autobiography is now taking a direction quite different from what I had imagined at the beginning. It has become a necessity for me to write down my early memories. If I neglect to do so for a single day, unpleasant physical symptoms immediately follow. As soon as I set to work, they vanish, and my head feels perfectly clear." End of quote. In April 1958, Jung finished the 3 chapters on his childhood, school days, and and years in the university. At first, he called them "On the Early Events of My Life." These chapters ended with the completion of his medical studies in 1900. This, however, was not the sole direct contribution that Jung made to the book. In January 1959, he was at his country house in Bollingen. He devoted every morning to reading chosen chapters of our book, which had meanwhile been hammered into shape. When he returned to the chapter, quote, "On life after death," unquote, he said to me, "Something within me has been touched, a gradient has formed, and I must write." Such was the origin of Late Thoughts, in which he voiced his deepest and perhaps most far-reaching convictions. In the summer of the same year of 1959, likewise in Bollingen, Jung wrote the chapter on Kenya and Uganda. The section on Pueblo Indians is taken from an unpublished and unfinished manuscript that deals with general questions of the psychology of primitives. In order to complete the chapter Sigmund Freud and Confrontation of the Unconscious, I incorporated a number of passages from a seminar developed in 1925 in which Jung spoke for the first time of his inner development. The chapter Psychiatric Activities is based on conversations between Jung and his young assistant doctors of the Zurich Mental Hospital of Burghölzli in 1956. At that time, one of his grandsons was working as a psychiatrist there. The conversations took place in Jung's house in Kusnacht. Jung read through the manuscript of this book and approved it. Occasionally he corrected passages or added new material. In turn, I have used the records of our conversations to supplement the chapters he wrote himself, have expanded his somewhat terse allusions, and have eliminated repetitions. The further the book progressed, the closer became the fusion between his work and mine. The genius of the book, to some extent, determined its contents. Conversation or spontaneous narration is inevitably casual, and the tone has carried over to the entire quote-unquote autobiography. The chapters are rapidly moving beams of light that only fleetingly illuminate the outward events of Jung's life and work. In recompense, they transmit the atmosphere of his intellectual world and the experience of a man to whom psyche was profound reality. I often asked Jung for specific data on outward happenings, but I asked in vain. Only the spiritual essence of his life's experience remained in his memory, and this alone seemed to him worth the effort of telling. Far more significant than the difficulties of formal organization of the text were those of prior obstacles of a more personal kind, to which Jung refers in a letter to a friend of his student days, replying to a request in the latter part of 1957 to set down the memories of his youth. He wrote, quote, "You are right. When we are old, we are drawn back, both from within and from without, to memories of youth. Once before, some 30 years ago, my pupils asked me for an account of how I arrived at my conceptions of the unconscious. I filled this request by giving a seminar. During the last year, the suggestion has come to me from various quarters that I should do something akin to an autobiography. I have been unable to conceive of my doing anything of the sort. I know too many autobiographies with their self-deceptions and downright lies, and I knew too much about the impossibility of self-portrayal to want to venture into any such attempt. Recently, I have asked for autobiographical information, and in the course of answering some questions, I discovered hidden in my memories certain objective problems, which seemed to call for closer examination. I have therefore weighed the matter and come to the conclusion that I shall fend off other obligations long enough to take up the very first beginnings of my life and consider them in an objective fashion. This task has proved so difficult and singular that in order to go ahead with it, I have had to promise myself that the results would not be published in my lifetime. Such a promise seemed to me essential in order to assure for myself the necessary detachment and calm. It became clear that all the memories which have remained vivid to me had to do with emotional experiences that arose uneasiness and passion in my mind, scarcely but the best condition for an objective account. Your letter naturally came at the very moment when I had virtually resolved to take the plunge. Fate will have it, and this has always been the case with me, that the outer aspects of my life should be accidental. Only what is interior has proved to have substantial and determining value. As a result, all memory of outer events has faded, and perhaps these outer experiences were never so very essential anyhow, or were only in that they coincided with the phases of my inner development. An enormous part of these outer manifestations of my life has vanished from my memory, for the very reason, so it seemed to me, that I participated in them with all my energies. Yet these are the very things that made up a sensible biography. Persons one has met, travels, adventures, entanglements, blows of destiny, and so on. But with few exceptions, all these things have become, for me, phantasms, which I barely recollect and which my mind has no desire to reconstruct, for they no longer stir my imagination. On the other hand, my recollection of my inner experiences has grown all the more vivid and colorful. This poses a problem of description which I scarcely feel able to cope with, at least for the present. Unfortunately, I cannot, for these reasons, fulfill your request, greatly as I regret my inability to do so." End of quote. This letter characterizes Jung's attitude. Although he had already resolved to take the plunge, the letter ends with a refusal. To the day of his death, the conflict between affirmation and rejection were never entirely settled. There always remained a residue of skepticism, a shying away from his future readers. He did not regard these memories as scientific work, nor even as a book by itself. Rather, he always spoke and wrote of it as an Aniela Jaffe's project, to which he had made contributions. At his very specific request, it is not to be included in his collected works. Jung had been particularly reticent in speaking of his encounters with people, both public figures and close friends and relatives. I have spoken with many famous men of my time, and great ones in science and politics. Well, this is a quote of Jung quote. I have spoken with many famous men of my kind, the great ones in science and politics, with explorers, artists, and writers, and princes and financial magnates. But if I am to be honest, I must say that only a few such encounters have been significant experiences for me. Our meetings were like those of ships on the high seas, when they dipped their flags to one another. Usually, too, these persons had something to ask of me, which I am not, sorry, return the page, which I am not at liberty to divulge. Thus, I have retained no memory of them, however important these persons may be in the eyes of the world. Our meetings were without portent. They soon faded away and bore no deeper consequence. But those of my relationships which are vital to me, which have come to me like memories of far-off times, I cannot speak, for they pertain not only to my innermost life, but also to that of others. It is not for me to fling open to the public eyes doors that are closed forever. The paucity of outward events is, however, amply compensated by the account of Jung's inner experiences and by a rich harvest of thoughts which, as he himself says, are an integral part of his journey. This is true first and foremost in his religious ideas, for this book contains Jung's religious testament. Jung was led to confrontation with religious questions by a number of different routes. There was his childhood visions, which brought him face to face with the reality of religious experience and remained with him to the end of his life. There was his insuppressible curiosity concerning everything that had to do with the contents of the psyche and its manifestations, the urge to know which characterized his scientific work, and, last but not least, there was his conscience as a physician. Jung regarded himself primarily as a doctor, a psychiatrist. He was well aware that the patient's religious attitude plays a crucial part in the therapy of psychic illness. This observation coincided with his discovery that the psyche spontaneously produces images with their religious content, that it is by nature religious, and also becomes apparent to him that numerous neuroses spring from a disregard of this fundamental characteristic of the psyche, especially during the second half of life. Jung's concept of religion differs in many respects from traditional Christianity, above all in his answer to the problem of evil and his conception of a God who is not entirely good or kind. From the viewpoint of dogmatic Christianity, Jung was distinctly an outsider. For all his worldwide fame, this verdict was forcibly borne in upon him by the reactions to his writings. This grieved him, and here and there in his book. In this book, he expresses the disappointment of an investigator who felt that his religious ideas were not properly understood. More than once he said grimly, quote, "They would have burned me as a heretic in the Middle Ages." Unquote. Only since his death have theologians in increasing numbers begun to say that Jung was indubitably an outstanding figure in the religious history of our century. Jung explicitly declared his allegiance to Christianity, and the most important of his work deals with the religious problems of the Christian. He looked at these questions from the standpoint of psychology, deliberately setting a bound between it and the theological approach. In doing so, he stressed the necessity of understanding and reflecting as against the Christian demand for faith. He took this necessity for granted as of the essential features of life. Quote, "I find that all my thoughts circle around God like the planets around the sun, and are as irresistibly attracted by him. I would feel it to be the grossest sin if I were to oppose any resistance to this force." Unquote. He wrote in 1952 to a young clergyman. This book is the only place in his extensive writing in which Jung speaks of God and his personal experience of God. While he was writing his youthful rebellion against the church, he once said, quote, "At that time I realized that God, for me at least, was one of the most immediate experiences." unquote. In his scientific work, Jung seldom speaks of God. There he is at pains to use the term, quote, the God image in the human psyche, unquote. This is no contradiction. In the one case, his language is subjective, based upon inner experience. In the other, it is the objective language of scientific inquiry. In the first case, he is speaking as an individual whose thoughts are influenced by passionate, powerful feelings, intuitions, and experiences of a long and unusually rich life. In the second, he is speaking as a scientist who consciously restricts himself to what may be demonstrated and supported by evidence. As a scientist, Jung is an empiricist. When Jung speaks of his religious experiences in this book, he is assuming that his readers are willing to enter into his point of view. His subjective statements will be acceptable only to those who have had similar experiences, or, to put it another way, to those in whose psyche the God image bears the same or similar features. Although Jung was active and affirmative in making of the autobiography for a long time, his attitude towards the prospect of its publication remained, quite understandably, highly critical and negative. He rather dreaded the reaction of the public, for one thing because of the candor with which he had revealed his religious experience and ideas, and for another because the hostility aroused by his book, Answer to Job, was still too close, and the incomprehension or misunderstanding of the world in general too painful. Quote, I have guarded this material all my life, and have never wanted it exposed to the world, for if it is assailed, I shall be affected even more than in the case of my other books. I do not know whether I shall be so far removed from this world that the arrows of criticism will no longer reach me, that I shall be able to bear the adverse reactions. I have suffered enough from incomprehension and from the isolation one falls into when one says things to people that people do not understand. If the Job book met with so much misunderstanding, my memoirs will have an even more unfortunate fate. The autobiography is my life, viewed in the light of the knowledge I have gained from my scientific endeavors. Both are one, and therefore this book makes great demands on people who do not know or cannot understand my scientific ideas. My life has been, in a sense, the quintessence of what I have written, not the other way around. The way I am and the way I write are a unity. All my ideas and all my endeavors are myself. Thus the autobiography is merely the dot in the I. End of quote. During the years in which the book was taking shape, a process of transformation and objectification was also taking place in Jung. With each succeeding chapter, he moved, as it were, further away from himself, until at last he was able to see himself as well as the significance of his life and work from a distance. Quote, if I ask the value of my life, I can only measure myself against the centuries, and then I must say, yes, it means something. Measured by the idea of today, it means nothing. Unquote. The impersonality, the feeling of historical continuity expressed in these words, emerges ever more strongly in the course of the book, as the reader will see. The chapter entitled The Work, with its brief summary of the genius of Jung's most important writings, is fragmentary. How could this be otherwise when his collective works comprise nearly 20 volumes? Moreover, Jung never felt any disposition to offer a summary of his ideas, either in conversation or in writing. When he was asked to do so, he replied in his characteristic, rather drastic fashion, quote, that sort of thing lies totally outside my range. I see no sense in publishing a condensation of papers in which I went to so much trouble to discuss the subject in detail. I should have to admit all my evidence and rely on a type of categorical statement which would not make my results any easier to understand. The characteristic ruminant activity of ungulate animals, which consists in the regurgitation of what has already been chewed over, is anything but stimulating to my appetite. End of quote. The reader should therefore regard this chapter as a retrospective sketch written in response to a special occasion and not expected to be comprehensive. The short glossary, which I have included at the end of the book at the publisher's request, I hope, be of help to the reader who is not familiar with Jung's work and terminology. I have taken a small number of the definitions from the Wartburg der Psychologie und ihrer Grenzgebiete, with the kind permission of the editor, Kurt von Sury, M.D., Whenever possible, I have elucidated the concepts of Jungian psychology by quotations from Jung's work and have supplemented the dictionary's definitions in the same way. These quotations must, however, be regarded as no more than suggestive hints. Jung was constantly defining his concepts in new and different ways, for an ultimate definition he felt was not possible. He thought it wise to let the inexplicable elements that always cling to psyche realities remain as riddles or mysteries. A great many persons have helped me with this inspiring and difficult task, and have shown unfailing interest through the slow growth of the book, and have furthered its progress by stimulating suggestions and criticism. To all of them I offer heartfelt thanks. And so then we'll go on to Jung. So, prologue. My life is a story of the self-realization of the unconscious. Everything in the unconscious seeks outward manifestations, and the personality, too, desires to evolve out of its unconscious conditions and to experience itself as a whole. I cannot employ the language of science to trace this process of growth in myself, for I cannot experience myself as a scientific problem. What we are to our inward visions, and what man appears to be sub specie aeternitalis, can only be expressed by way of myth. Myth is more individual and expresses life more precisely than does science. Science works with concepts of averages, which are far too general to do justice to the subjective variety of an individual life. Thus it is that I have now undertaken, in my 83rd year, to tell my personal myth. I can only make direct statements, only tell stories. Whether or not the stories are true is not the problem. The only question is whether what I tell is my fable, my truth. An autobiography is so difficult to write because we possess no standards, no objective foundation from which to judge ourselves. There are really no proper basis for comparison. I know that many things I am not. I know that in many things I am not like others, but I do not know what I really am like. Man cannot compare himself with any other creature. He is not a monkey, not a cow, not a tree. I'm a man. But what is it to be that? Like every other being, I am a splinter of the infinite deity, but I cannot contrast myself with the animal, any plant, or any stone. Only a mythical being has a range greater than man's. How, then, can a man form any definite opinion of himself? We are a psychic process, which we do not control or only partly direct. Consequently, we cannot have any final judgment about ourselves or our lives. If we had, we would know everything, but at most that is only a pretense. At bottom, we never know how it is. At bottom, we never know how it has all come about. The story of a life belongs somewhere at a most particular point. At some particular point, we happen to remember. The story of a life begins somewhere at some particular point we happen to remember, and even then, it was already highly complex. We do not know how life is going to turn out. Therefore, the story has no beginning, and the end can only be vaguely hinted at. The life of a man is a dubious experiment. It is a tremendous phenomenon, only in numerical terms. Individuality. It is so fleeting, so insufficient, that it is literally a miracle that anything can exist and develop at all. I was impressed by the fact long ago that as a young science I was impressed by that fact long ago as a young medical student, and it seemed to me miraculous that I should not have been prematurely annihilated. Life has always seemed to me like a plant that lives on its rhizome. It's true, life is invisible, hidden in the rhizome. The part that appears above ground lasts only a single summer, then it withers away, an empirical apparition. When we think of the unending growth and the decay of life and civilizations, we cannot escape the impression of absolute nullity. Yet I have never lost a sense of something that lives and endures underneath the eternal flux. What we see is blossoms which pass. The rhizome remains. In the end, the only events in my life worth telling are those when the imperishable world interrupted into this transitory one. That is why I speak clearly of that is why I speak chiefly of inner experiences, amongst which I include my dreams and visions. These form the prima materia of my scientific work. They are the fiery magnet out of which the stone that had to be worked was crystallized. All other memories of travels, people, and my surroundings have paled beside these inner happenings. Many people have participated in the story of our times and written about it. If the reader wants an account of that, let him turn to them or get somebody to tell it to him. Recollection of the outward events of my life have largely faded or disappeared, but my encounters with the other reality, my bouts with the unconscious, are indelibly engraved upon my memory. In that realm, there has always been wealth and abundance, and everything else has lost importance by comparison. Similarly, other people are established inalienable in my memories only if their names were entered in the scrolls of my destiny from the beginning, so that encountering them was at the same time a kind of recollection. Inner experiences also set their seal on the outward event that came on my way and assumed importance for me in youth or later on. I early arrived at the insight that when no answer comes from within to the problems and complexity of life, they ultimately mean very little. Outward circumstances are no substitute for inner experiences. Therefore, my life has been singularly poor in outward happenings. I cannot tell much about them, for it would strike me as hollow and insubstantial. I can understand myself only in the light of inner happenings. It is these that make up the singularity of my life, and with these my autobiographical details. Chapter 1. First Years. When I was 6 months old, my parents moved from Caswell on Lake Constance in Leuven, the castle and vicarage above the falls of the Rhine. This was in 1875. My memories begin with my second or third year. I recall the vicarage, the garden, the laundry house, the church, the castle, the falls, the small castle of Worth, and the sexton's farm. There are nothing but islands of memories afloat in a sea of vagueness, each by itself, apparently with no connection between them. One memory comes up, which is perhaps the earliest in my life, and indeed only a rather hazy impression. I am lying in the pram in the shadow of a tree. It is a fine, warm summer day. The sky blue, the golden sunlight darting through green leaves. The hood of the pram has been left up. I have just awakened to the glorious beauty of the day and have a sense of indiscernible well-being. I see the sun glittering through the leaves and blossoms of the bushes. Everything is wholly wonderful, colorful, and splendid. Another memory. I am sitting in our dining room, on the west side of the house, perched in the high chair, and spooning up warm milk with bits of broken bread in it. The milk has a pleasant taste and a characteristic smell. This was the first time I became aware of the smell of milk. It was the moment when, so to speak, I became conscious of smelling. This memory, too, goes very far back. Still another. A lovely summer evening. An aunt said to me, "Now I am going to show you something." She took me out in front of the house on the road to Dachau. On the far horizon, the chain of Alps lay bathed in the glowing sunset reds. The Alps could be seen very clearly that evening. "Now look over there," I can hear her saying to me in a Swiss dialect. "The mountains are all red." For the first time, I consciously saw the Alps. Then I was told that the next day the village children would be going on a school outing to Uetliberg near Zurich. I wanted so much to go too. To my sorrow, I was informed that children as small as I could not go along, that there was nothing to be done about it. From then on, the Uetliberg and Zurich became an unattainable land of dreams near the glowing snow-covered mountains. From a somewhat later period, another memory. My mother took me to the Thurgau to visit friends who had a castle on Lake Constance. I could not be dragged away from the water. The waves from the steamer washed up to the shore. The sun glistened on the water, and the sand under the water had been curled into little ridges by the waves. The lake stretched away and away into the distance. This expanse of water was an inconceivable pleasure to me, an incomparable splendor. At that time the idea became fixed in my mind that I must live near a lake. Without water, I thought, nobody could live at all. Still another memory comes up. Strangers, bustle, excitement. The maid comes running and exclaims, "The fishermen have found a corpse. Come down from the falls. They want to put it in the wash house." My father says, "Yes, yes. I want to see the body at once." My mother holds me back and sternly forbids me to go into the garden. When all the men have left, I quickly stole into the garden to the wash house, but the door was locked. I went around the house. At the back there was an open drain running down the slope. I saw blood and water trickling out. I found this extraordinarily interesting. At that time I was not yet 4 years old. Yet another image. I am restive, feverish, unable to sleep. My father carries me in his arms, paces up and down, singing his old student songs. I particularly remember one I was especially fond of, and which always used to soothe me. Alles schweig, Jader neig. The beginning went something like that. To this day I can remember my father's voice singing over me in the stillness of the night. I was suffering, so my mother told me afterwards, from general eczema. Dim intimations of trouble in my parents' marriage hovered above me. My illness in 1878 must have been the connection with a temporary separation of my parents. Must have been connected with a temporary separation of my parents. My mother spent several months in a hospital in Basel, and presumably her illness had something to do with the difficulty in their marriage. An aunt of mine, who was a spinster and some 20 years older than my mother, took care of me. I was deeply troubled by my mother's being away. From then on, I always felt mistrustful when the word love was spoken. The feeling I associated with woman was for a long time that of innate unreliability. Father, on the other hand, meant reliability and powerlessness. This is the handicap I started off with. Later, these early impressions were revisited. I have trusted men friends and been disappointed by them. I have mistrusted women and was not disappointed. While my mother was away, our maid, too, looked after me. I still remember her picking me up and laying my head against her shoulder. She had thick black hair and an olive complexion and was quite different from my mother. I can see, even now, her hairline, her throat, with its darkly pigmented skin, and her ear. All this seemed to me very strange and yet strangely familiar. It was as though she belonged not to my family but only to me, as though she were connected in some way with other mysterious things I cannot understand. This type of girl later became a component of my anima. Footnote: for this and other technical terms that are commonly used by young but may be unfamiliar to the blah blah. Okay. The feeling of strangeness which she conveyed, and yet of having known her always, was characteristic of that figure which later came to symbolize for me the whole essence of womanhood. From the period of my parents' separation, I have another memory image. A young, very pretty and charming girl with blue eyes and fair hair is leading me on a blue autumn day under the golden maple and chestnut trees along the Rhine below the falls near Worthgassel. The sun is shining through the foliage, and the yellow leaves lie on the ground. This girl later became my mother-in-law. She admired my father. I did not see her again until I was 21 years old. These were my outward memories. What follows now are more powerful, indeed overwhelming images, some of which I recall only dimly. There was a fall downstairs, for example, and another fall against the angle of the stove leg. I remember pain and blood, a doctor sewing a wound in my head. The scar remained visible until my senior year at the gymnasium. My mother told me, too, of the time when I was crossing the bridge over the Rhine Falls to Neuhassen. The maid caught up with me just in time. I already had one leg under the railing and was about to slip through. These things point to an unconscious suicidal urge, or, it may be, to a fatal resistance to life in this world. At that time, I also had vague fears at night. I would hear things walking around in the house. The muted roar of the Rhine falls was always audible, and all around lay a darker zone. People drowned, bodies were swept over rocks. In the cemetery nearby, the sexton would dig a hole. Heaps of brown unturned earth. Black, solemn men in long frock coats with unusually tall hats and shiny black boots would bring a black box. My father would be there in his clerical gown, speaking in a resounding voice. Women wept. I was told that someone was being buried in this hole in the ground. Certain persons who had been around previously would suddenly no longer be there. Then I would hear that they had been buried, and that the Lord Jesus had taken them to himself. My mother had taught me a prayer which I had to say every evening. I gladly did so because it gave me a sense of comfort in the face of the vague uncertainness of the night. The prayer. Spread out thy wings, Lord Jesus smiled, and take thee thy chick, thy child. If Satan would devour it, no harm shall overpower it. So let the angels sing. End of the prayer. Lord Jesus was comforting, a nice, benevolent gentleman like Herr Wittgenstein up at the castle, rich, powerful, respected, and mindful of little children at night. Why he should be winged like a bird was a conundrum that did not worry me further. Far more significant and thought-provoking was the fact that little children were compared to chicks, which Lord Jesus evidently took reluctantly, like bitter medicine. This was difficult to understand, but I understand at once that Satan liked chicks and had to be prevented from eating them. So, although Lord Jesus did not like the taste, he ate them anyway so that Satan would not get them. As far back as that went, my argument was comforting. But now I was hearing that Lord Jesus took other people to himself as well, and that this taking was the same as putting them in a hole in the ground. This sinister analogy had unfortunate consequences. I began to distrust Lord Jesus. He lost the aspect of a big, comforting, benevolent bird, and became associated with the gloomy black men in frock coats, top hats, and shiny black boots who busied themselves with the black box. These ruminations of mine led to my first conscious trauma. One hot summer day, I was sitting alone, as usual, on the road in front of the house, playing in the sand. The road led past the house, up a hill, then disappeared in the wood on a hilltop. So far from the house you could see a stretch of the road. Looking up, I saw a figure in a strangely broad hat and a long black garment coming down from the wood. It looked like a man wearing woman's clothes. Slowly the figure drew near, and I could see now that it was really a man wearing a kind of black robe which reached to his feet. At the sight of him I was overcome with fear, which rapidly grew into deadly terror as the frightful recognition shot into my mind. That is a Jesuit. Shortly before, I had overheard a conversation between my father and a visiting colleague, concerning the nefarious activities of the Jesuits. From the half-irritated, half-fearful tone of my father's remarks, I gathered that Jesuits meant something especially dangerous, even for my father. Actually, I had no idea what Jesuits were, but I was familiar with the word Jesus from my little prayer. The man coming down the road must be in disguise, I thought. That was why he wore woman's clothes. Probably he had evil intentions. Terrified, I ran helter-skelter into the house, rushed up the stairs, and hid under a beam in the darkest corner of the attic. I don't know how long I remained there, but it must have been a fairly long time, because when I ventured down again to the first floor and cautiously stuck my head out of the window, far and wide there was not a trace of the black figure to be seen. For days afterwards the hellish fright clung to my limbs and kept me in the house, and even when I began to play in the road again, the wooded hilltop was still the object of my uneasy vigilance. Later I realized, of course, that the black figure was a harmless Catholic priest. At about the same time, I could not say with absolute certainty whether it preceded this experience or not, I had the earliest dream I can remember, a dream which was to preoccupy me all my life. I was then between 3 and 4 years old. The vicarage stood quite alone near Loughton Castle, and there was a big meadow stretching back from the sexton's farm. In the dream I was in the meadow. Suddenly I discovered a dark, rectangular, stone-lined hole in the ground. I had never seen it before. I ran forward curiously and peered down into it. Then I saw a stone stairway leading down. Hesitantly and fearfully I descended. At the bottom was a doorway with a round arc, closed off by a green curtain. It was a big, heavy curtain of worked stuff like brocade, and it looked very sumptuous. Curious to see what might be hidden behind, I pushed it aside. I saw before me a dim light of like a rectangular chamber about 30 feet long. The ceiling was arched and of heavy stone. The floor was laid with flagstones, and in the center a red carpet ran from the entrance to a low platform. On this platform stood a wonderfully rich golden throne. I am not certain, but perhaps a red cushion lay on the seat. It was a magnificent throne, a real king's throne in a fairy tale. Something was standing on it, which I thought at first was a tree trunk, 12 to 15 feet high and about 1.5 feet or 2 feet thick. It was a huge thing, reaching almost to the ceiling, but it was of a curious composition. It was made of skin and naked flesh, and on top there was something like a rounded head with no face and no hair. On the very top of the head was a single eye, gazing motionlessly upward. It was fairly light in the room, although there were no windows and no apparent sources of light. Above the head, however, was an aura of brightness. The thing did not move, yet I had the feeling that it might at any moment crawl off the throne like a worm and creep towards me. I was paralyzed with terror. At that moment I heard a voice from outside. I heard from outside and above me my mother's voice, and she called, "Yes, you look at him. That is the man-eater." Yes, you look at him. That is the man-eater. That intensified my terror still more, and I woke sweating and scared to death. For many nights afterwards I was afraid to go to sleep because I feared I might have another dream like that. This dream haunted me for years. Only much later did I realize that what I had seen was a phallus, and that it was decades before I understood that it was a ritual phallus. I could never make out whether my mother meant, "That is the man-eater," or "That is the man-eater." In the first case she would have meant that not Lord Jesus nor the Jesuit was the devourer of little men, but the phallus. In the second case, that the man-eater in general was symbolized by the phallus, so that the dark Lord Jesus, the Jesuit, and the phallus were identical. The abstract significance of the phallus is shown by the fact that it was enthroned by itself. Ithith phallically, ithus upright. The hole in the meadow probably represented a grave. The grave itself was an underground temple whose green curtain symbolized the meadow, in other words, the mystery of the earth with her covering of green vegetation. The carpet was blood red. What about the vault? Perhaps I had already been to the citadel of the Schaffhausen. This was not likely, since no one would take a 3-year-old up there. So it cannot be a memory trace. Equally, I do not know where the anatomically correct phallus could have come from. The interpretation of the orificium urethra as an eye, with a source of light apparently above it, points to an etymology of the word phallus, phallus shining bright. At all events, the phallus of the stream seems to be a subterranean god not to be named, and such it remained throughout my youth, reappearing whenever anyone spoke too emphatically about Lord Jesus. Lord Jesus never quite, Lord Jesus never became quite real for me, never quite acceptable, never quite lovable, for again and again I would think of his underground counterpart, a frightening revelation, which had been accorded to me without my seeking it. The Jesuit's disguise cast its shadow over the Christian doctrine I had been taught. Often it seemed to me a solemn masquerade, a kind of funeral at which the mourners put on serious or mournful faces, but the next moment were secretly laughing or not really sad at all. Lord Jesus seemed to me in some ways a god of death, helpful it is true, in that he scared away the terrors of the night, but himself uncanny, a crucified and bloody corpse. Secretly his love and kindness, which I always heard praised, appeared doubtful to me, chiefly because the people whom talked about this dear Lord Jesus wore black frock coats and shiny black boots, which reminded me of burials. They were my father's colleagues as well as 8 of my uncles, all parsons. For many years they inspired fear in me, not to speak of occasional Catholic priests who reminded me of a terrifying Jesuit who had irritated and even alarmed my father. In later years, until my confirmation, I made every effort to force myself to take the required positive attitude to Christ, but I could never succeed in overcoming my secret distrust. The fear of the quote-unquote black man, which is felt in every child, was not the essential thing in the experience. It was rather the recognition that stabbing through my childish brain, quote, there is a Jesuit, unquote. So the important thing in the dream was the remarkable symbolic setting and the astounding interpretation. That is the man-eater. Not the child's ogre of a man-eater, but the fact that this was the man-eater, that it was sitting on a golden throne beneath the earth. From my childish imagination, it was first of all the king who sat on the golden throne, then, on a much more beautiful and much higher and much more golden throne, far, far away in the blue sky, sat God and Lord Jesus, with golden crowns and white robes. Yet from this same Lord Jesus came the Jesuit in black woman's garb, with a broad black hat down from the wooded hill. I had to glance up there every so often to see whether another danger might not be approaching. In the dream, I went down into the hole in the earth and found something very different on the golden throne, something non-human and underworldly, which gazed fixedly upward and fed on human flesh. It was only 50 years later that a passage in a study of religious rituals burned into my eyes concerning the motif of cannibalization that underlies the symbolism of the Mass. Only then did it become clear to me how exceedingly unchildlike, how sophisticated and over-sophisticated was the thought that had begun to break through into consciousness in these two experiences. Who was it speaking in me? Whose mind had devised them? What kind of superior intelligence was at work? I know every numbskull will babble on about black man, man-eater, chance, and retrospective interpretation in order to banish something terribly inconvenient that might sully the familiar picture of childhood innocence. Ah, these good, efficient, healthy-minded people, they are always reminding me of those optimistic tadpoles who bask in a puddle under the sun in the shallowest of waters, crowding together and amiably wiggling their tails, totally unaware that the next morning the puddle will have dried up and left them stranded. Who spoke to me then? Who talked of problems far beyond my knowledge? Who brought the above and below together and laid the foundation for everything that was to fill the second half of my life with the stormiest passion? Who but that alien guest who had come from both above and from below? Through this childhood dream, I was initiated into the secrets of the earth. What happened then was a kind of burial in the earth, and many years were to pass before I came back out again. Today I know that it happened in order to bring the greatest possible amount of light into the darkness. It was an initiation into the realm of darkness. My intellectual life had its unconscious beginnings at that time. I no longer remember our move to Klein Hunningen near Basel in 1879, but I do have a memory of something that happened several years later. One evening my father took me out of bed and carried me in his arms to our porch, which faced west. He showed me the evening sky, shimmering in the most glorious green. That was after the eruption of Krakatoa in 1883. Another time my father took me outside and showed me a large comet on the eastern horizon. And once again a great flood. The river Weiss, which flowed through the villages, had broken its dam, and in its upper reaches a bridge had collapsed. 14 people were drowned and were carried down by the yellow flood water to the Rhine. When the water retreated, some of the corpses got stuck in the sand. When I was told about it, there was no holding me. I actually found the body of a middle-aged man in a black frock coat. Apparently he had just come from church. He lay away half covered in sand, his arms over his eyes. Similarly, I was fascinated to watch a pig being slaughtered. To the horror of my mother, I watched the whole procedure. She thought it terrible, but the slaughtering and the dead men were simply matters of interest to me. My earliest memories of art go back to those years in Klein Hunningen. The house where my parents lived was the 18th century parsonage, and in it there was a dark room Here all the furniture was good and old paintings hung on the walls. I particularly remembered an Italian painting of David and Goliath. It was a mirror copy from the workshop of Guido Reni. The original hangs in the Louvre. How it came into our family, I do not know. There was another old painting in that room, which now hangs in my son's house, a landscape of basil dating from the early 19th century. Often I would steal into that dark, sequestered room and sit for hours in front of these pictures, gazing at all this beauty. It was the only really beautiful thing I knew. About that time I must have been a very little fellow, no more than 6 years old. An aunt took me to Basel and showed me the stuffed animals in the museum. We stayed a long time because I wanted to look at everything very carefully. At 4 o'clock the bell rang, a sign that the museum was about to close. My aunt nagged me, but I could not tear myself away from the showcases. In the meantime the room had been locked, and we had to go another way to the staircase through the gallery of antiquities. Suddenly I was standing before these marvelous figures. Utterly overwhelmed, I opened my eyes wide, for I had never seen anything so beautiful. I could not look at them long enough. My aunt pulled me by the hand to the exit, and I trailed, always a step behind her, crying out, "Disgusting boy, shut your eyes! Disgusting boy, shut your eyes!" Only then did I see that the figures were naked and wore fig leaves. I hadn't noticed it at all before. Such was my first encounter with the fine arts. My aunt was shimmering with indignation, as though she had just been dragged through a pornographic institute. When I was 6 years old, my parents took me on an excursion to Arleshelm. On this occasion my mother wore a dress I have never forgotten, and it is the only dress of hers that I can recall. It was of some black stuff, printed all over with little green crescents. My earliest recollection of my mother is of a slender young woman wearing this dress. In all my other memories she is older and corpulent. We came to the church, and my mother said, "This is a Catholic church." My curiosity, mingled with fear, prompted me to slip away from my mother and peer through the open door at the interior. I just had to glimpse the big candles on a richly adorned altar. It was around Easter, when I suddenly stumbled on a step and struck my chin on a piece of iron. I remember that I had a gash that was bleeding badly when my parents picked me up. My state of mind was curious. On the one hand, I was ashamed because my screams were attracting the attention of the churchgoers. On the other hand, I felt that I had done something forbidden. Jesuits, green curtains, secrets of the man-eating, so that in the Catholic Church, which has to do with Jesuits, it is their fault that I stumbled and screamed. 4 years afterwards, I was unable to set foot inside a Catholic church without a secret fear of blood and falling and Jesuits. That was the aura or atmosphere that hung about it, but at the same time it always fascinated me. The proximity of a Catholic priest made me even more uneasy, if that were possible. Not until I was in my 30s was I able to confront Mater Ecclesia without the sense of oppression. The first time was in St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna. Soon after I was 6, my father began giving me Latin lessons, and I went to school. I did not mind school. It was easy for me, since I had always been ahead of the others and had learned to read before I went there. However, I remembered a time when I could not yet read, but pestered my mother to read aloud to me out of the Orbis Pictus, an old, richly illustrated children's book, which contained an account of exotic religions, especially that of the Hindus. There were illustrations of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, which I found an inexhaustible source of interest. My parents later told me that I was always returned to these pictures. Whenever I did so, I had an obscure feeling of their affinity with my original revelation, which I never spoke of to anyone. It was a secret I must never betray. Indirectly, my mother confirmed this feeling, for the faintest tone of contempt with which she spoke of the heathens did not escape me. I knew that she would reject my revelation with horror, and I did not want to expose myself to any such injury. This unchildlike behavior was connected, on the other hand, with an intense sensitivity and vulnerability. On the one hand, with an intense sensitivity and vulnerability, and on the other hand, and this especially, with the loneliness of my early youth. My sister had been born 9 years after me. I played alone and in my own way. Unfortunately, I cannot remember what I played. I only recall that I did not want to be disturbed. I was deeply absorbed in my games and could not endure being watched or judged when I played them. My first concrete memory of games dates from my 7th or 8th year. I was passionately fond of playing with bricks and built towers which I then rapturously destroyed by an earthquake. Between my 8th and 11th year I drew endlessly, battle pictures, sieges, bombardments, naval engagements. Then I filled a whole exercise book with ink blots and amused myself giving them fantastic interpretations. One of my reasons for liking school was that there I found at least the playmates I had lacked for so long. At school I also discovered something else. Before I go into this, I should first mention that the nocturnal atmosphere had begun to thicken. All sorts of things were happening at night, things incomprehensible and alarming. My parents were sleeping apart. I slept in my father's room. From the door to my mother's room came frightening influences. At night my mother was strange and mysterious. One night I saw coming from her door a faintly luminous, indefinite figure whose head detached itself from the neck and floated along in front of it in the air like a little moon. Immediately another head was produced and again detached itself. This process was repeated 6 or 7 times. I had anxiety dreams of things that were now small, now large. For instance, I saw a tiny ball at a great distance. Gradually it approached, growing steadily into a monstrous and suffocating object. Or I saw telegraph wires with birds sitting on them, and the wires grew thicker and thicker, and my fear greater until the terror awoke me. Although these dreams were overtures to the psychological changes of puberty, they had in their turn a prelude which occurred about my 7th year. At that time I was sick with pseudo-croup, accompanied by choking fits. One night during an attack I stood at the foot of my bed, my head bent back over the bed rail, while my father held me under the arms. Above me I saw a glowing blue circle, about the size of a full moon, and inside it moved golden figures which I thought were angels. This vision was repeated, and each time it allayed my fear of suffocation, but the suffocation returned in the anxiety dream. I see it in this psychogenetic factor. The atmosphere of the house was beginning to be unbreathable. I hated going to church. The one exception was Christmas Day. The Christmas carol, "This is the day that God has made," pleased me enormously. And then in the evening, of course, came the Christmas tree. Christmas was the only Christian festival that I could celebrate with fervor. All the others left me cold. New Year's Eve alone had something of the attractiveness of Christmas, but definitely took second place. Advent had a quality about it that somehow did not fit in with the coming Christmas. It had to do with the night storms and the wind, and also with the darkness of the house. There was something whispering, something queer going on. I return now to the discovery I made in the course of associating myself with my rustic schoolmates. I found that they alienated me from myself. When I was with them, I became different from the way I was at home. I joined in their pranks or invented ones which at home would never have occurred to me. So it seemed, although, as I knew only too well, I could hatch up all sorts of things when I was alone, it seemed to me that the change in myself was due to the influence of my schoolfellows, who somehow misled me or compelled me to be different from what I thought I was. The influence of this wider world, this world which contained others besides my parents, seemed to me dubious, if not altogether suspect, and in some obscure way hostile. Though I became increasingly aware of the beauty of the bright daylight world where, quote, golden sunlight filters through green leaves, unquote, at the same time I had a premonition of an inescapable world of shadows, filled with frightening, unanswerable questions, which had led me at their mercy. My nightly prayer did, of course, grant me a ritual protection, since it concluded the day properly, and just as properly ushered in night and sleep. But the new peril lurked by day. It was as if I sensed a splitting of myself, and feared it. My inner security was threatened. I also recall from this period, 7 to 9, that I was fond of playing with fire. In our garden there was an old wall built of large blocks of stone, the interstices of which made interesting caves. I used to tend a little fire in one of these caves, with other children helping me, a fire that had to burn forever and therefore had to be constantly maintained by our unified efforts, which consisted in gathering the necessary wood. No one but myself was allowed to tend the fire. Others could light other fires in other caves, but these fires were profane and did not concern me. My fire alone was living, and had an unmistakable aura of sanctity. In front of this wall was a slope on which was embedded a stone that jutted out. my stone. Often, when I was alone, I sat down on this stone and then began an imaginary game that went something like this. I am sitting on top of the stone, and it is underneath. But the stone could also say I, and think, I am lying here on this slope, and he is sitting on top of me. The question then arose, am I the one who's sitting on the stone, or am I the stone on which he is sitting? This question always perplexed me, and I would stand up, wondering who was what now. The answer remained totally unclear, and my uncertainty was accompanied by a feeling of curious and fascinating darkness. There was no doubt whatsoever that this stone stood in some secret relationship to me. I could sit on it for hours, fascinated by the puzzle it sent me. 30 years later, I again stood on that slope. I was married, a married man, had children, a house, a place in the world, and a head full of ideas and plans, and suddenly I was again the child who had kindled a fire full of secret and significance, and sat down on a stone without knowing whether it was I or I was it. I thought suddenly of my life in Zurich, and it seemed alien to me, like news from some remote world and time. It was frightening, for the world of my childhood in which I had just become absorbed was eternal, and I had been wrenched away from it, and had fallen into a time that continued to roll onward, moving further and further away. The pull of that other world was so strong that I had to tear myself violently from the spot in order not to lose hold of my future. I have never forgotten that moment, for it illuminated in a flash of lightning the quality of the eternity in my childhood. What this meant was revealed soon afterwards in my 10th year. My disunion with myself and the uncertainty in the world at large led me to an action which at the time was quite incomprehensible to me. I had in those days a yellow, varnished pencil case of the most commonly used by primary school pupils, with a little lock and the customary ruler. At the end of the ruler I now carved a little mannikin about 2 inches long with a frock coat, top hat, and shiny black boots. I colored him black with ink and sawed him off the ruler and put him in the pencil case, and there I made him a little bed. I even made a coat for him out of a little bit of wool. In the case I also placed a smooth oblong blackish stone from the Rhine, which I had painted with watercolors to look as though it were divided into an upper and lower half, and had long carried it in my trouser pocket. This was his stone. All this was a great secret. Secretly I took the case to the forbidden attic at the top of the house, forbidden because the floorboards were worm-eaten and rotten, and hid it with great satisfaction on one of those beams under the roof, for no one must ever see it. I knew that not a soul would ever find it there. No one could discover my secret and destroy it. I felt safe, and the tormenting sense of being at odds with myself was gone. In all difficult situations, whenever I had done something wrong, or my feelings had been hurt, or when my father's irritability or my mother's invalidism oppressed me, I thought of my carefully bedded down and wrapped up mannikin in a smooth, prettily colored stone. From time to time, often at intervals of weeks, I secretly stole up to the attic where I could be certain that no one would see me. Then I clambered up on the beam, opened the case, and looked at my mannikin and his stone. Each time I did this, I placed in the case a small scroll of paper, on which I had previously written something during school hours in a secret language of my own invention. The addition of the new scroll always had a character of solemn ceremonial act. Unfortunately, I cannot remember what I wanted to communicate to the mannikin. I only know that my letters constituted a kind of library for him. In fact, though I cannot be certain, that they may have consisted of sayings that particularly pleased me. The meanings of these actions, or how I might explain them, never worried me. I contented myself with the feeling of a newly won security, and was satisfied to possess something that no one knew and no one could get at. It was an inviolable secret which must never be betrayed, for the safety of my life depended on it. Why that was so I did not ask myself. It simply was so. This possession of a secret had a very powerful formative influence on my character. I considered it the essential factor of my boyhood. Similarly, I never told anyone about the dream of the phallus and the Jesuit who belonged to that mysterious realm, which I knew I must not talk about. The little wooden figure with the stone was the first attempt, still unconscious and childish, to give shape to the secret. I was always absorbed by it, and had the feeling I ought to have fathomed it, and yet I did not know what it was I was trying to express. I always hoped I might be able to find something, perhaps, in nature that would give me the clue and show me where or what the secret was. At that time, my interest in plants, animals, and stones grew. I was constantly on the lookout for something mysterious. Consciously, I was a religious in the Christian sense, although always with the reservation, but it is not so certain as all that, or what about that thing under the ground? And when religious teachings were pumped into me and I was told this is beautiful and this is good, I would think to myself, yes, but there is something else, something very secret that people don't know about. The episode with the carved mannequin formed the climax and the conclusion of my childhood. It lasted about a year. Thereafter, I completely forgot the whole affair until I was 35. Then this fragment of memory rose up again from the mists of childhood with pristine clarity. While I was engaged on a preliminary study for my book, Woodlagen und Symbole der Libido, Psychology of the Unconscious, 1917, edited and retitled Symbols of Transformation, I read about the cache of soul stones near Arlichsham and the Australian Churringas. I suddenly discovered that I had a quite definite image of such a stone, though I had never seen any reproductions. It was oblong, blackish, and painted into an upper and lower half. This image was joined by that of the pencil box and the mannequin. The mannequin was a little cloaked god of the ancient world, a telephoros, such as stands on the monuments of Asclepius and reads to him from the scroll. Along with this recollection, there came to me for the first time the conviction that there are archaic psychic components which have entered into the individual psyche without any direct line of tradition. My father's library, which I examined only very much later, contained not a single book which might have transmitted such information. Moreover, my father demonstrably knew nothing about these things. When I was in England in 1920, I carved out of wood 2 similar figures, without having the slightest recollection of that childhood experience. One of them I had reproduced on a larger scale in stone, and this figure now stands in my garden in Kushnaj. Only while I was doing this work did the unconscious supply me with a name. They called the figure Atma Viktu, the breath of life. It was a further development of that fearful tree in my childhood dream, which now revealed as the breath of life, the creative impulse. Ultimately, the mannequin was a Kabir wrapped in his little cloak, hidden in the kista, and provided with a supply of life source, the oblong black stone. But these are connections which became clear to me only much later in life. When I was a child, I performed the ritual just as I have seen it done by the natives of Africa. They act first, and do not know what they are doing. Only long afterwards do they reflect on what they have done. Reader's commentary. So one of the things that I think is interesting about this is how Jung had these experiences, um, these experiences of the eternal, these archaic experiences. And I think that that's innate in children, that pretty much all children have those, but that we don't necessarily recognize that, partly because we don't have the language for that, and that that's one of the reasons I'm so interested in Jung, and that he was the person who helped develop that language. But if you look at kids or talk to kids, from the ones that that they're just starting to talk to older kids and ask them what's going on, really try to find out, you'll see that they do have those experiences. And I think if one spends enough time thinking about one's past, one can remember having similar kinds of experiences. And that 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 being precocious or being wealthy and having lots of access to all kinds of intellectual or other resources doesn't predicate that one would have similar experiences to Jung. I think those are innate in every individual and every child. The other thing that I would say is it bothers me, Jung's treatment of what he calls primitives, and I feel like that he makes these broad statements about how Africans would have these rituals and not even think about it. I think that that's indicative of a bias and prejudice that bothers me about him, and I wish that he had been able to see a little further and have a little more a little more of the sort of world view, wider view, bigger picture view that he obviously has. I don't understand why he couldn't see that and apply that to why he couldn't see his own cultural prejudice. So thank you for listening.